The number one thing you want to talk about, and the number one thing I don't want to talk about. Let's talk about geopolitics for 2026 on the weekly update. Okay, friends, I don't want to do it. Trump is making me do it. You're making me do it. So let's do it. Geopolitics Primer 2026. Here's what you need to know. First up, we're going to be taking a break from markets. I've got one slide to tell you about what I see in the market. But what we're going to do is we're going to clear all the geopolitical stories of the day. And what I'm going to do is I'm not just going to talk about the stories of the day. I'm going to give you a geopolitics primer, my view, my framework for evaluating geopolitical issues for basically the back half of the decade. So you probably haven't heard this anywhere else because this is my personal thoughts about things. But there's a danger here, and this is why I didn't want to talk about this and why I still don't. So I'm going to give you a warning. Here's the warning. We're going to be discussing dangerous knowledge today. And what dangerous knowledge means is I find that non-institutional investors over-index on big sweeping explanations of the world. What this means is after I tell you this stuff and maybe it resonates with you, maybe you find there's some validity to it, the risk is that you're going to use it to color your investment decisions. So nothing that we discuss today is actionable investing intelligence. Markets run on economics, not geopolitics. A lot of this is my personal read of the situation and therefore a hypothesis built on incomplete information, bias, even probably disinformation and propaganda. Fifth generation warfare, that is warfare that is done in social media, through controlling narratives, through shaping the information space. Fifth generation warfare has been a thing since 2003. It is 2026. So what that means is the tactics of fifth generation warfare of narrative control are really, really good these days. So we don't know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. We're in an adverse information environment. Okay? So there's all the warnings. There's everything out of the way. But we're going to talk about why things are happening. So that way, if you have any questions about geopolitics or what comes next, that's what this video is for. First up, we're going to take a look at the market. Red is the S&P 500, the same way you've always seen it. Orange is the 50-day, purple is the 200. And what do you notice? Well, our uptrend continues unabated. Yesterday, we did have a test of the 50-day, kind of came down and kissed it, and we're getting a bounce right off it, exactly where we would expect it to. So this looks like good 50-day, support is holding here. And all of this, what's causing this correction, basically a one-day tumble, is the discussion about Greenland and about Europe and what's going on in the world. We're going to cover all of that today. We're going to talk about all of Greenland, all of Venezuela, and all these things. But what I can tell you is, at least if we look at the market, uptrend's still intact. And these are geopolitical issues, so they should not hit us in the economic sphere. So things look pretty good. Okay, so the market looks fine. Now let's get to the dangerous stuff. All right, so I'm going to start off with a thesis. I'm going to give you my thesis up front, and then I'm going to walk you through how I get there and how I think it helps give us some predictions about what's going to happen from here. So here's my geopolitics thesis for 2026 to about as far ahead as you want to go. Here's my thesis. I believe that we are in Cold War 2.0. This is the second time that you're hearing me say Cold War 2.0 on the channel, and possibly in the foothills of World War III. Now, as I say that, that sounds extremely bombastic to say, so I'm going to, I'm not trying to make clickbait here, so I'm going to diffuse that statement here for a second. Probabilities of Cold War 2.0 is 100%. It's already happening. That's where we are. It's this battle of U.S. hegemony versus the multipolar world. Probabilities of World War III, I think it's 10% or less. And I think it's 10% or less because this would be the best outcome for the United States. The United States has tremendous military reserves. The U.S. would love to fight it out. The U.S. is begging to fight it out. And that's why I don't think we're going to fight it out. I think our adversaries are pretty smart, and I think they're going to try and out-science us, out-economy us, out-produce us, out-infrastructure us. That's how our adversaries are going to fight us. I don't think they're going to send the boys into the trenches because if they do that, if you do that against the United States, you're going to lose to it. But here's what I mean by the foothills of World War III, if we are going to get that, which I think is pretty remote. But if you look at World War II, It's widely accepted that World War II began September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. But one of the things that I always love to do is I always love to look at the precursors to that. And if you look at what were the foothills, what were those first sort of developments that put us on the path to World War II, it actually starts almost 10 years before what we recognize as the beginning of the conflict. I think it starts with Japan invading Manchuria, China. Right here you have the fault lines beginning of what would eventually become World War II, centered on one of the belligerents of World War II, and it's a conflict, half a world away, feels remote to what was going on between Germany and Poland at those times. But really, these were the kind of beginning undulations. And my view of warfare is it's a wheel that spins out of control. And at each step along the way, there are escalations that happen that increase the spinning. And eventually, if you get enough sort of like cyclonic activity, you will get something like a world war. So I think, you can see Japan and China belligerency here. Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933, again, 6 years before the war. So like, if you were living through this history, you had a long time to wait, right? Someone looking at the Japanese and Chinese conflict saying, oh my God, this is going to become a conflict that embroils the world. Well, by 1933, maybe they would say, well, that's kind of silly. And then 1935 happens, the Italo-Ethiopian War, and here we have yet another belligerent in World War II doing something. And so it's these small conflicts, these little flashpoints around the world. There's little fires that get lit, and eventually they will all come together into a wildfire. But still, I mean, again, even at this point, we're 3 years, 4 years before the start of the war. Germany reoccupies the Rhineland, Spanish Civil War, Second Sino-Japanese War, right? Like all these things. World War II actually begins in Asia, and it begins 2 years before Germany goes into Poland, right? I think that's an interesting sort of perspective. And so all I'm saying is all this stuff, the stuff before 1939, is the foothills of World War II. And in much the same way, if we get a World War III, which I don't think we will, but if we get a World War III, then I think the foothills of World War III is Russia, Ukraine, is Houthis and Operation Prosperity Guardian, is Iran and Israel, is Venezuela, and whatever conflicts come from here. So in much the same way, you can sort of see the battle lines kind of hazily being drawn until they get sort of solidified in 1939. I think we're in a similar sort of hazy battle lines being drawn in World War III if we get one. And right now, the probabilities, I don't think we get one. All right, but who are the sides in this conflict? What are we talking about here even? Well, we're talking about U.S. hegemony versus multipolarity. And I've shared with you a picture of Modi, Xi Jinping, and Putin before, and I said, I think this picture is going to be definitional of the age. And clearly, the more time that passes, I think the better that take ages. This is the new big three. These are basically the three heads of the multipolar world. They are one side of this conflict. On the other side of this conflict is U.S. hegemony. And, that's sort of the world that we know. I mean, you guys are primarily U.S. based. So that's the world that we inhabit, that we exist in. And clearly, the U.S. is trying to sort of keep the post-World War II order together in a way. Whether it can do that or not, I think there's some interesting developments there as we start to talk about this. And then who's in the middle of all of this? Well, in the middle is everybody else, is Europe, is Canada, is South America, is Mesoamerica. So we've basically got U.S. hegemony versus multipolarity. And I think as we start to look at some of these developments, I think it's clear one side has the momentum right now, and the other side is somewhat counterplaying. So let's look at the two sides and let's ask the question, what do they want? And I think it's pretty easy to know what they want. You just have to listen to what they say. So what does the multipolar world want? What does Russia, China, India, and the rest of the world want? This one is so interesting to me. I talk about an adverse information environment. We absolutely are there on this stuff. I tried to hunt down a news article for Putin talking about the golden billion. He's talked about it numerous times. There isn't a single news article that I can show you that isn't what I would call quote unquote yellow journalism, isn't just some bombastic sort of thing about Putin being a madman. He is not a madman. He is, if you've seen the interview with Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, he's actually very well grounded in history and very incremental and legalist. China, the same. Getting any good information on any of these two guys in the U.S. information sphere is nearly impossible. But here's what Russia says. The so-called golden billion has been practically parasitizing on other peoples for 500 years. And what he's saying here is the golden billion, which is US and Europe, we've got all the wealth and the rest of the world has all the work. They tore apart the peoples of Africa. They exploited Latin America. They exploited Asia. They spent centuries filling their bellies with human flesh and their pockets with money. But they must realize that the vampire ball is ending. And here's what I'll also say about the adverse information environment. I can only find these quotes on Twitter. So let's just consider them. These are propaganda sources, right? But I'll take that over the Western journalism, which I don't think is a very accurate retelling. So what does Putin say? Putin says, I think the US and Europe are a little too big for their britches and we need a rebalancing. What does China say? The world cannot return. This was China in Davos, so this was yesterday. The world cannot return to the law of the jungle, where the strong prey on the weak. China is willing to be not only the world's factory, but also the world's market. Globalization faces challenges from rising protectionism. China offers certainty amid uncertainty. So what China is saying here is saying, hey, the world doesn't need to change just because Donald Trump came in. If you want to exist in that pre-2016 world of liberalized trade, China is here to help you. And so what these two messages are we want to shrink the U.S. sphere of influence. And I don't want you to look at these as Russia and China. I would rather you look at these two nations as this is the world's resources and this is the world's factory. Russia, the only reason why, we have to listen to what Russia says at all is I think there's something like 40% of the world's platinum, 15% of the world's fertilizer, 30% of the world's wheat, which is damn near 30% of the world's carbohydrates, 30% of the world's coal. So this is the raw materials speaking here. And when China speaks, the only reason why we have to listen to China is 30% of the world's manufacturing. It's the factory of the world. And 30% of the world's science as well. And so what you have here is you have the raw materials that go into the factory, the world's factory, and the world's science. And basically they're arguing with the US, which is the world's wealth, to say, hey, I actually want a fairer redistribution of the wealth. That's what the multipolar world wants. They want to shrink U.S. Hegemony. They want to shrink U.S. influence, and they want, a fairer distribution of the pie. Okay, so that's one side of the equation. What does the U.S. want? Well, very simply, the U.S. wants autarky. And autarky is a self-sufficient nation. What that means is production and consumption occurs within the economy, and there is no foreign trade or influence. This is isolationism, but it goes beyond isolationism. It's almost like hermeticism. It's like becoming a hermit kingdom. The U.S. is sort of realizing that it can't enforce the global order anymore, and so the U.S. is falling back to defensible lines. Now, that's a lot to swallow, especially in a post-World War II sort of mode. Like, I get it. I just said something big there. I think the Russia-China thing is pretty clear. You've been primed for those sorts of messages, so it's very easy to, get around to those. On the U.S. side, however, that's probably the first time you've heard about, wait, what do you mean? The U.S. wants to abandon the rest of the world? So I got a picture for you. What does autarky look like? Well, mercifully, thankfully, Donald Trump has put a picture on Truth Social. You want to know what autarky looks like? It looks like this. It looks like the U.S. owning Canada, owning Greenland, owning Venezuela, controlling Mesoamerica, controlling South America, the U.S. basically retreating into its hemisphere. That's what autarky looks like. And so the U.S. can basically stand up an entire economy in this hemisphere, and leave the other hemisphere to the wolves, to say that we can't project power anymore. We can't protect these sea lanes. Our allies are of dubious quality out there anyway. And so we're just falling back to defensible lines. We're sort of making a fire break around this hemisphere and letting whatever happens on the other side, let the wildfire sort of rage. And so here's what that means. Here's what autarky means for basically U.S. strategy going forward from here. So let's talk Venezuela, Mexico, and the Panama Canal. I think if you look at South America, Mesoamerica, what's going on there, I think you've got to look at it through the lens of what happened during Operation Prosperity Guardian. Prosperity Guardian was the operation that the U.S. did against the Houthis. It was the largest naval armada that we've assembled since World War II. Here's 16 August of 2024. We basically put 1/3 of the Navy in the Middle East, in the Arabian Sea, by the Gulf of Oman to try and reopen the Suez Canal. We launched countless airstrikes. We hit them with Reaper drones and Hellfire missiles and Arleigh Burke cruisers and all of our best stuff. And the net effect of doing this is we didn't reopen the Suez Canal. This is the Suez Canal Authority. You can look at these yearly navigation statistics. Prosperity Guardian was launched in 2024. Here's 2025. Cargo tonnage is still down 75%. The Houthis, Donald Trump, would tell you that victory was done in Prosperity Guardian. The Houthis are going to stand down, but they have not stood down. As of 2026, they continue to strike commercial vessels destined for Israel through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. And this was important to me because this is sort of how the U.S. loses a military conflict. The U.S. loses a military conflict, and it's so quiet you can hear a pin drop. and we just sort of forget about that. Then we start sort of coping with that and say, well, maybe international law sort of, tied our hands, which, on the back of Venezuela and this Greenland thing, clearly that wasn't the case. But I think what the U.S. learned in Prosperity Guardian is they learned sea lanes are very dangerous. And you hear the rhetoric ramping up on things like the Panama Canal. I think all of that is based on what we've learned about underwater drones in the Ukrainian conflict and in Prosperity Guardian. What we've learned is that drones, missiles, anti-ship missiles are actually extremely capable, and we don't really have good countermeasures for that. And so therefore, we can no longer enforce sea lanes anymore. And if we can't enforce sea lanes, then globalization collapses. And if globalization collapses, then you need autarky. Then you need to produce everything in a contiguous landmass. So I think that that's where this is coming from. It's coming from what happened in Prosperity Guardian. I think we believe that there is some danger around the Panama Canal. That's what Venezuela was about. And I think using this to predict the future, I think next you will start hearing a lot about Mexico. So Mexico is next on the menu because Mexico is being sort of colonized economically by China. And if I'm correct about all this stuff, we won't allow that because we want autarky, and we can't have a compromised sea navigable environment on this hemisphere. So that's the South. How about the North? How about Greenland? All right, so we're finally talking about Greenland. We're 20 minutes in. Sorry this one's so long, but I want this to be the first, last, and only time we talk about geopolitics. And then we can just use this framework to fill in everything else that's going on. So how about Greenland and the Arctic? What's it about? Well, it's about the future. And the future is that the Arctic ice caps are melting, and this will create a sea-based route to Europe from Asia that will be probably some of the richest trade routes in the world. So that way trade no longer has to go around the world. It no longer has to go through the US. Trade can go directly from Asia to Europe. It's a big win for Europe. It's a big loss for the US in controlling the economies of the world. I think also Greenland has value related to interception of ballistic missiles. I don't think it's surprising that Trump said, hey, we're going to do this Golden Dome sort of ballistic missile defense. And then immediately after that, we start talking about Greenland because all the missiles from Russia are going to come over the polar ice cap if they're going to come ever at all. And I don't think they will. But if they do, Greenland is extremely valuable in that scenario. Greenland is extremely valuable for the U.S. in denying Canada's claim to the Northwest Passage. The U.S. denies that these are Canadian waters. The U.S. says that these are international straits. And so Greenland is all about putting U.S. on this side, U.S. on this side, and then claiming in international court that these are international straits, and therefore the U.S. Navy can use this whenever it wants. It doesn't need to ask Canada for permission. And the reason why is Canada is economically colonized by China, and therefore they're an unreliable ally. So what is all this battle in the Arctic about? It's about missile defense and it's about controlling sea lanes. I do not believe it's about resources at all. The U.S. largely doesn't develop its resources anyway. If we get Greenland, I don't think we develop the resource deposits there. It's too remote and tough. So I think this is entirely about power projection. And so this is what Greenland is about. I think it's about the sea lanes. And I think, that's my expectation. And what I would think going forward is if this is a true way of looking at the world, I think we find some way to get Greenland or at least get concessions there. And then I think the very next thing that happens is we start turning up the pressure very significantly on Canada. And so if this is a correct way of looking at the world, Canada is going to be in the crosshairs next. If this is a correct way of looking at the world, Mexico is going to be in the crosshairs next. The Panama Canal will be retaken by the U.S., right? So what we're doing is I'm giving you this kind of bombastic sort of theory, but I'm also planting seeds that says, okay, if this is correct, this is where we go. So that's what I think is happening. That's what I think is going on. I think we're absolutely in Cold War 2.0 and with a low probability of being in World War 3. And the reason why is because the low probability is because I don't think Russia and China wants to fight it out with us. I think that's how they lose. And I think there's a lot of different ways that they can win if everything I say is correct. So here's the question we want to ask ourselves, right? Maybe you don't want to do this at all. Maybe you might say, why do we have to beat up Europe and our allies? Why are we doing this to Greenland? Why are we doing this to Denmark? Do we have to do this at all? Can everything just stay the way it was? And the answer is no. Everything can't stay the way it was because these forces that are causing this conflict are in motion. These forces were in motion before the U.S. did any of this. Here's August 18, 2025. China launches 18-day Arctic Express container ship route to Europe with stops in UK, Germany, and Poland. And one of the things that I've been watching is Chinese Arctic shipping in 2025. I don't care what you think about global warming. I don't care what you think about if the polar ice caps are going to melt or not. What I can tell you is that to the Chinese Navy, to the Russian Navy, and to the U.S. Navy, they are behaving as if the polar ice caps are melting. The Arctic cap is melting. And that's really all that matters. And in fact, China is sending non-ice rated ships through the north as we speak. This was August of last year. You probably didn't hear much about it. I did because I was following things like this. How about Chinese big underwater drone push, undersea power towards U.S. shores, could threaten undersea cable, sensor networks, and even the strategic balance across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. This was December of last year. These are gigantic Chinese drones, and these aren't even the biggest ones that they have. So can everything just stay the way it was? Does the U.S. need to behave in this way? Can we just keep pretending that the post-World War II order is still in place? And the answer is absolutely not. No, because these forces are already going. Technological advancement in munitions, seen in Ukraine, seen in Prosperity Garden, are forcing us to take control of things like the Panama Canal, Venezuela, etc. Technological advances and climatic change are forcing us to take over Greenland and to deny Canada its waterways and to try and push for autarky. That's just the way it goes. So, and that's really how I would view this.
I don't view this as, someone making these things happen. I think it's a reaction to technological change and disruption causing these systems to naturally change. So, what does this all mean? We've spent 20 minutes together. What does it mean? Geopolitics Primer 2026. Well, here's what I'll tell you. Today, we did a dangerous thing, and I gave you my geopolitics primer for the back half of the decade. Remember, none of this is actionable. I'm just giving you, you want geopolitics? You've got all the geopolitics you can stomach right now. I believe that Cold War 2.0 is virtually assured because we're already in it, and I think we've got a very low chance of a World War III brewing, kind of like that foothills of World War III, 10 years or more away. Cold War 2.0 is a battle between U.S. hegemony and multipolarity. The U.S. wants autarky, so the U.S. wants an economy that produces and consumes inside of its own hemisphere with no need for the rest of the world. We're cutting a fire break between us, Russia, and China, the world's resources and the world's factory, and we're just kind of leaving them to the wolves. I believe that the through line from Operation Prosperity Guardian to Venezuela and Greenland seems clear to me. And if correct, I would expect to see pressure on Canada and Mexico next, because they have been colonized by the Chinese in their own sort of ways, and the U.S. is going to need to assert its dominance there. And I think that's what's so interesting, as you see this Greenland thing, and as Canada and Mexico, should we get those developments, in the coming decade, that will be interesting to me because we sort of need Canada and Mexico and the Panama Canal to play ball. We don't need Europe to play ball. Europe is not in our hemisphere. Europe is not a part of this autarky. And so what that means is you can sort of see us cutting ties with Europe. Even what Trump says about Russia, Ukraine, he says Europe's going to have to figure it out, right? So it's very clear to me that not in the hemisphere, you're on your own. We're sort of throwing you to the wolves. And here, finally, whether anyone wants this transition or not, it's happening. The only choice that America has is how it responds. So there you go. A ton of geopolitics, an extremely long one. But if you want to talk geopolitics, we can talk geopolitics. This is the way I see the world. It's just my personal opinion. Like I said, a lot of this comes from an adverse information environment. So we want to be careful with that. And I'll see you guys next week. We're going back to economics. We're going back to the markets. We're going back to all that stuff. So yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Okay, friends, that was the video. Hope you liked it. If you found it informative, good, entertaining, I'd love if you could scroll down here beneath the video and give me a like there. It helps us out with the algorithm. And then if you want to be notified first of anything new that we upload to the channel, if you come over here, click subscribe. You'll be the first to know as soon as we upload anything. Appreciate it. See you soon.